Welcome to Transparency and Ethics Committee, our first meeting. First of all, we'll do requests for bill introductions. Do we have any bill requests today? All right. I did want to point out to the committee, we do have our committee rules. There's one additional, and this would just be for Randy's sake. If you can't be here and you're going to WebEx in, we would like you to let us know so we can count your attendance. So that's rule number 17. So those are here for you to put in your folders. And since we all know each other as senators, I do want to recognize our newest member, Senator Tim Schallenbarger, and Randy made him a really nice name tag until his official one comes, so we know who he is over here. So welcome to our committee, Senator Tim. We're happy to have you here. And as you know, this committee is also local government, so we sit in the same place and we're near the same place. And so we won't introduce ourselves, but I would like staff to introduce themselves so you all know who we're working with this year. And so we have Randy Walters, my committee assistant and assistant with us, and she's been with me 7 years, which is exciting. So you go right ahead.
Good morning. My name's Elena Rudder. I'm a research analyst with Legislative Research, and this is my third session.
Jill Shelley, research analyst, KLRD, and my first session was in 2008.
Charles Reimer with the Revisor's Office. Jason Long will also be assisting this committee with the Revisor's Office.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Dusty Ralston. I am with Broadcast Services, and this is my second session.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for helping us. We know staff is very important to what we do, so we very much appreciate you if you don't hear that enough, so thank you. Well, the only thing on our agenda today is just an update, and we'll make sure we get out of here by 20 after or so, Mark, if that's all right, or even quicker than that. Okay, so we have Kansas Governmental Ethics Commission, Mark Skoldland, the Executive Director. Welcome to the committee, Mark. And before you start, I might, in case my friends have to leave from home, I have representatives from the city of Marysville with me in the back, so welcome and thanks for hanging out with us for a bit. And if you have to sneak out, we totally understand. So welcome to the Capitol. All right, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and always to talk about the great work of the commission, the Governmental Ethics Commission, and my staff. If there's ever anything that we can help with, please use us as a resource. Always feel free to reach out to our office. The 2022 annual report covers essentially a little initial look at everything that we did in fiscal year 22. It doesn't include the last election that will be in the next annual report, because typically the annual report covers a fiscal year, but it does cover quite a bit of content regardless. At the end of the annual report is the legislative recommendations, which usually are where a lot of questions arise from, and I'm here to answer any questions that you may have. So first, I want to briefly just flip over to page 4, just a quick look at our commission staff. I know you have worked with quite a few of these people in one capacity or another. I'm sure you've worked with Karina when filing your campaign finance reports. You've worked with Roxy on anything to do with your statement of substantial interests. I have to say I'm exceedingly lucky to have the staff that I have. They are brilliant, incredibly competent staff that really supports the state extremely well, and I am very lucky to have them. On page 6 is education and public awareness. That we always put this first because this is our first priority, is to educate and prevent issues before they occur and essentially make the public aware that we exist. The primary purpose of the Governmental Ethics Commission is to allow the public to have faith in governmental decision making by essentially being an independent oversight on these sorts of issues, on ethics and campaign finance issues. So as part of education and public awareness, I specifically go out and do trainings and other presentations, mostly trainings. I provided 16 presentations in fiscal year 22. That's a little higher than previous years. In future, I want to report this by number of attendees or number of people who get trained for a couple reasons. Number one, I've given trainings to 2 people and I've given trainings to 250 people. So the number of presentations is not always the most relevant number, but we do quite a few trainings for a lot of people, for sure. Now on page 7 is a quick look at our advisory opinions. In fiscal year 22, we issued 5 advisory opinions. Now, anyone who is subject to the laws of the Governmental Ethics Commission can request a formal advisory opinion that the commission will draft and essentially decide. And if you follow the strictures of a formal advisory opinion, then you are deemed to have followed the law. You did not violate the law if you follow that opinion. So essentially, there is a way for people to check to make sure that certain activity is not a violation before it occurs. Now, we also have at the back in one of the appendices, there is a look at what those 5 opinions were. Some of these opinions are very complicated matters about local governance, conflict of interest issues, and some of them in previous years have included things like, for example, requiring paid-for attribution on paid text messages that have express advocacy. So they can span quite a few issues. On page 8, again, this is a look at campaign finance. It doesn't include the election, but obviously everyone files a January 10th campaign finance report. On just that January 10th report, there were 1,462 reports that were submitted. Anyone who has an open account of any kind always has to file a January report. At the bottom there, you'll see a look at our audits. We can conduct audits in a variety of ways. There were 6 audits that were conducted in fiscal 22. Audits typically fall into one of 3 categories. The biggest category is voluntary audits. That's where someone calls our office and says, look, I've done everything I can. I don't know where this $2,500 went in my campaign account. Can you help us? They give us our bank records. We work with them, fix it. They amend their report. That's most of our audits. We can do investigatory audits as well, and we can also do random audits. If we do a random audit, then we randomize essentially a district that where we are going to audit everyone who ran for office in that particular instance and check all of those reports. So those are the 3 ways we can do an audit, but almost all of them are voluntary audits historically. On page 9, I just want to mention something very quickly. Out of that 1,462 reports, 202 of those reports received an error and omission notice. I'm sure there are people on this committee who have received those E&O notices and been concerned. No one likes getting mail from the Ethics Commission. Well, this is me reassuring you that you are in good company. There are a lot of people who receive error and omission notices. They're not a big deal. We can always help you fix them and move on. Page 10 is statement of substantial interests. In the state, 5,700 SSIs, statement of substantial interests, were filed last year. In that box in the middle, you can see kind of that breakdown. Obviously, most of them are employees listed as designees, which is basically employees who are in policymaker positions, anything like that, or certain budgetary positions in agencies have to file those SSIs. That's most of it. But there's also some board members, all general counsels have to file them, etc. The next page, we'll take a look at lobbying on page 11. In calendar year 2022, there were nearly 600 lobbyists that were registered, which is a little higher than previous years, representing almost 1,900 organizations. They filed in that year, before the January report, which is the last 3 months of the year, they filed over 5,000 receipts and expenditures reports. A couple things that I think are interesting here. They filed over 5,000 reports and only 77 of them received a failure to file notice. This is because of 2 reasons. This is because we have amazing staff. Jessica White works with those lobbyists extremely well. And also, we just have a very good lobbying community in Kansas that are very responsive and file their documents appropriately. That's a 98.5% compliance rate for lobbyist filing, which is very impressive, and I think would rival almost any state. Also worth noting, in 2021, in the entire calendar year, lobbyist expenditures were under $450,000. In just the first 3 months of 2022, it was $555,000 already. So the pandemic, I'm assuming the pandemic had a pretty substantial impact on lobbying expenditures in 2021. But in general, that was just an extremely low year for lobbying expenses. That's probably the lowest that it has been since we were tracking lobbying expenses. On page 12, a quick look at inquiries and investigations. We handled 26 investigations and inquiries in fiscal year 2022. Also, these numbers happen to be the same, but there's not typically a relation between them. There were 26 complaints that were filed in that fiscal year as well. 12 of those were dismissed for without probable cause determinations. Usually what this is someone has not filed a report that they have to file. We've sent them a failure to file. They were assessed a civil penalty. Another month goes by and they still have not filed the report. We eventually have to file a complaint. And if they file their report before the hearing occurs, typically the commission will dismiss those items. And that's usually what we're seeing here. 7 complaints did have a public hearing. 2 were settled, 4 are ongoing, and 1 was dismissed for lack of jurisdiction, which someone walking in the door with a complaint thinking that we could handle something that is not actually a violation of our laws. It happens a lot. Usually we resolve those before someone files a complaint, but it does happen occasionally. At the bottom on page 12 still, you can see our civil penalties. Civil penalties are automatically assessed by operation of law from late filing of campaign finance reports, but they can be waived for good cause shown. Good cause can mean anything from I was sick or a family member was sick to really anything. We've seen waiver requests really run the gamut. There were over $38,000 assessed in penalties, and just over $11,000 of that was waived in fiscal year 22. On page 13 is a look at our fines as well. We assessed $74,000 in fines in fiscal 22 as a result of 10 civil fine hearings. 8 of those were just for context, out of those 10 civil fine hearings, 8 of those were failure to file reports. Only 2 of them were other items, one of which was several years of illegal lobbying that resulted in a fine of $28,750, which is a huge chunk of that $74,000. And the only other fine at issue was $250. So most of those fines are get your reports in on time, please, is really what that comes down to. So the next is legislative recommendations of the commission, but I'll note just real quick, there's an appendix 1, like I mentioned, for the opinions that we've issued in fiscal 22, and then the second appendix on page 22 is a 10-year look at lobbying expenses broken down by category. You can see it's pretty swingy. There's back in 2015 it was 1.7 million, and obviously in 2021 it was only $448,000. So it's a pretty dramatic shift. I can definitely pause for questions at this time, or I can launch directly into the legislative recommendations, which I know are typically subject to questions as well.
Why don't you keep going, Mark, and we'll save them for the end. Yeah.
So we have a few commission recommendations for this year for legislation. The first is electronic filing for state candidates. I'm going to save you some time. We've talked about this many times. You know our viewpoint on the efficiency and monetary savings that this would provide, as well as just in straight efficiency savings for our office. However, last year the House passed this item. It was not scheduled for any floor debate in the Senate. We don't think that the scenario has changed dramatically. We understand there are concerns about the e-filing system that some people would like resolved first. So we are advocating that this should happen, but we're not going to introduce a bill for it this year. So the second, I'm sorry.
We didn't get above the line last year, did we, Mark? We passed it out of committee, but then it didn't get worked, and well, that's okay. And I'd like to talk about that when Mark wraps up.
The second is a cleanup mega bill. This is the same cleanup mega bill we had last year. There are mostly things that are one statute was updated and the other statute was not. For example, those of you who, if there's a candidate who doesn't want to file reports and they're not going to raise or expend money, it used to be that if that limit was $500, if you raise more than that, you can't file an affidavit. Several years ago, the legislature increased that amount to $1,000. The problem is there's a separate statute that says if you exceed the affidavit, you have to go back and file all those reports. But that number was never changed. So it's things like that, little statutory conflicts mostly. I will note that last year we discussed these issues and there was some concern there was an item about essentially our ability to talk to the FEC and federal officials about investigations. We removed that because there were, I think, a lot of concerns about basically us talking to the FEC about items. So we removed that entirely from the cleanup bill. Our goal is to make the cleanup bill entirely non-controversial. I don't really think there's anything in here we think it's an important bill to pass. pass. Our statutes need to be cleaned up a bit, and it would help us as well. The third is everyone's favorite topic, I'm sure, cryptocurrency, campaign finance contributions. I will note that right now there is no law on the books at all that is specific to virtual currency or cryptocurrency for campaign finance in Kansas. Now, campaign finance in Kansas has not engaged the issue of cryptocurrency in any meaningful way. We've had one question, an informal question back in 2018, I think, where a campaign wanted to accept cryptocurrency in a campaign. The commission had 3 meetings on the subject and ultimately issued a statement that said, functionally, please don't do this. They had a lot of concerns about transparency of cryptocurrency, but it was not a formal opinion. And partly this is because the law does not foreclose that in any way. Right now, it is kind of the Wild West for campaign finance contributions that are in cryptocurrency. We don't think that's the right way to go. And in talking to other states who have dealt with this issue, cryptocurrency in some form is likely coming to Kansas campaign finance, and we'd like to get ahead of the issue, be a little proactive. Essentially what this does is it allows cryptocurrency to be received by a campaign up to the $100 cash limit from one person. This is the same kind of idea because if we audited a campaign and they said we received $100 in cash, we can say, okay, well, we see the deposit of cash, but we have no way to confirm where that came from. Cryptocurrency in a lot of respects is very similar in our view, and so the cash limit seems to apply here as well. There's also some other requirements that essentially campaigns have to disclose the amount of the cryptocurrency they receive. They have to they can't spend campaign finance dollars out of cryptocurrency. They have to convert it to US dollars first. There is a bill that I believe was just introduced on the House side that also includes a couple provisions, essentially requiring that a cryptocurrency processor processing campaign finance contributions in Kansas must use what's called Know Your Customer protocols. So essentially the processor has an ability to check name and address and report that to the campaign as well. So there's another layer of assurance about who is actually providing the contribution. And also the House version, I believe, has language that says that a campaign cannot hold cryptocurrency. They have to convert it to US dollars immediately upon receipt. So cryptocurrency is something that is not regulated right now. We think there should be some sort of regulation on it and some limits, some requirements. If the legislature would rather outright ban cryptocurrency contributions, I don't think the commission would oppose that. I think that would be, right now the concern is that there's just no regulation. There needs to be something covering the issue. The last item is support of federal candidates. Right now, there is a specific prohibition in the law that says that any funds collected under the Campaign Finance Act by anyone cannot be used in or for the campaign of someone for federal elective office. This means PACs, it means party committees, central committees. Those all, when they receive money, they cannot use them in or for a campaign for federal office. There's no exceptions to it. It's very broad language. This means central committees cannot go out and buy Trump, DeSantis, Biden signs. They can't do that. It would be a violation of the laws here. We don't think that's correct. We think there's not much benefit to that prohibition. So we are encouraging that the legislature carve out PACs and parties from this prohibition. Campaigns already probably cannot do this, but we can leave campaigns in the prohibition. The big issue here is that PACs and parties, we don't understand why that prohibition would exist. That's really why central committees exist, is to support their candidates in that area. So that might include federal candidates. We don't see a reason to include that prohibition. So it's our view that there needs to be a carve out there to allow PACs and parties that flexibility. I will also note we don't have a formal legislative recommendation on these items. We know that there's legislation out there to fix the paid-for attribution on local candidates that are outside of our jurisdiction, like second-class cities, as well as constitutional ballots, local ballot issues, things like that. That statute is not in our jurisdiction, but we're generally favorable to updating a statute that I believe was last updated in the early 2000s to include the same kind of information that's required here, but it's not our jurisdiction, so if that bill comes up, we'll probably testify neutrally and just provide input on it. There's also a bill out there to fix some express advocacy issues, and we can talk about that if it comes up as well. But with that, that is everything I've got in the annual report. I can certainly take any questions you may have. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. We like having you here, too. This is right up our alley of this committee. So let's see, did I miss Senator Dahl?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Eric, for your presentation. I know, right now there's nothing we can do. Is there any way that we can trace back? I mean, government's supposed to be transparent. The dark money, getting the postcards that we're getting or getting these things that are completely, entirely false, but there's no way who it's paid for by. What kind of legislation can we pass that we can know who we are telling these such lies and such? I mean, I've been pictured with a lot of people I don't even know, and how can we do that? What kind of legislation?
Well, I definitely appreciate the concern. So I'll tell you briefly, the state of the law is that if a communication includes express advocacy, then typically it requires paid-for attribution, except in a few instances, like if volunteers are texting or sending text, things like that. But generally speaking, if a communication has express advocacy, it needs to have paid-for attribution. In Kansas, the statute that defines express advocacy defines it as 9 phrases. And if those phrases are used, it is express advocacy. If those are not used, it is not. Before about 2000, the commission employed a totality of the circumstances test. There's language in the statute that says including but not limited to these 9 phrases. That statutory test was ruled vague by federal district court in, I believe, 1999. Since then, there has not been a substitute test. There's a bill that's been introduced, I believe now, to fix the express advocacy definition, to adopt what is the new federal standard, and what some states have approached as well, essentially meaning that if a communication has only one reasonable interpretation, and that's to encourage a vote for or against a candidate at an election, then it's treated exactly the same as if they used those 9 phrases. So essentially what this means is, we call it the only reasonable interpretation test. Right now, if there's a mailer that goes out that says candidate A is the best for crime, when you go to the ballot box, remember to decrease crime. That is not express advocacy in Kansas today. There's no paid-for attribution required on that mailer that very obviously is encouraging a vote for or against a candidate. The standard that is used federally and has been upheld as constitutional repeatedly would include this. Paid-for attribution would be required. I will note that there's a lot of issue advocacy out there as well. When candidate A voted to increase your taxes, this is call them and tell them how much you disagree with that.
Thank you. Last one. I don't know if you remember, but last year we had a huge amendment, and there was a lot of nonprofits that were advocating how to vote on this particular amendment. And it's my understanding that nonprofits, like a church, cannot advocate for a political campaign like that, but yet it was everywhere. Why? Why was that allowed?
Sure. So that question would actually be outside our jurisdiction. It's because I think the question is targeted at an organization's nonprofit status, so it may be a revenue or IRS question. My understanding, and I'm only providing this as just an observer to the issue, is that some of those prohibitions apply to advocacy for candidates, not so constitutional amendments. That's my understanding of the issue. But again, I'm really just an observer on those issues. For us, constitutional amendments have one statute, and it's essentially that if an organization has raised money specifically to advocate about a constitutional amendment, and then they go engage in some activity to advocate for or against the amendment, then they have to disclose their donors and expenditures. But other than that, we have no jurisdiction over any constitutional ballot question. There is a statute that requires paid-for attribution on some of those items. That's the statute I was mentioning earlier that's outside of our jurisdiction. It's 252407. It hasn't been updated in a long time. I know there's some people who are interested in updating that statute. I am happy to provide commentary and assistance to any effort for that, but we have no dog in the fight there as the Ethics Commission.
Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, thank you for coming. You give us a lot of information, got two different questions, and not very difficult, I don't think, and there are two different areas. So I give them both to you, and you can handle it how you want to. In your budget, the final budget, 253,000 plus is from fines and stuff. I wonder if you just kind of touch on that. I know some of them you waive, you mentioned. And then the second one, when you did the state conflict of interests, the first one, it says a state employee may work two different state positions the same day when official duties for each do not overlap, and work performed for one position would not occur during time compensated by the other. That was kind of on page 20, the top one. I wonder if you could give me some kind of example of what you're talking here. I don't want to have you disclose something you're not supposed to disclose, but I would just be interesting how that works. And thank you.
Great, and I appreciate the opportunity. So our budget is about 70 to 75% state general fund. The other portion is our fee fund. Our fee fund, almost all of the fee fund is lobbyist registrations, candidate registrations, PAC registrations. There's a very small component that is fines and penalties. When we budget, we assume that number is zero. We assume we receive no fines and penalties. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the big one for me is a policy goal. We shouldn't be relying on fines and penalties to fund an agency. That would be I feel like I was talking to, it was either Tunisia or Nigeria. They had an ethics commission that was funded entirely on fining and penalizing people. And they understood why, but obviously they had a pretty sizable credibility concern there, where it was perceived that they were just fining people to fund their bottom line. Now, that's not what we do in Kansas, thankfully. It's not what any ethics commission does in the US that I'm aware of. It does go into our fee fund, but it's not part of our budgeting process. The second question about opinion 2021-01, which is described in brief on page 20. So formal opinions are public. This is a public document. You can go look at the facts that were under consideration and the particular the analysis that was provided by the commission. Essentially, the issue here is that someone who is on the clock as a state employee cannot receive compensation from the private sector for something that is part of their official duties. I give trainings. If someone lost their mind and offered me compensation to provide an ethics training, I could not accept that. So essentially this is resolving that it's possible that someone could be working two different positions as long as essentially they're not being compensated for one by the other and there's no other conflict in their duties that would come up. So I don't recall these specific facts. I believe this opinion was issued back in probably August 2020. No, yep, July 2021. Yep. So it's been a while since I've looked at this particular set of facts, but I'm happy to provide a copy of the opinion for you and any background facts if you'd like. But it was, this was a lot of our opinions are relatively straightforward outside of some of the local conflict of interest issues, which are sometimes very complicated and fact dependent, but this was a fairly straightforward one in our perspective.
Any other questions? Senator Schellenberger.
Thank you. Carryover candidates. So I'm assuming that if you've lost your election or you didn't run again, you can keep your campaign funds. How long can you keep that? Is there any prohibition against how long you can keep those funds?
Nope. Kansas lets you keep those campaign finance accounts open for as long as you feel like.
And are those listed somewhere? Can we see those?
We can provide them. Yeah, anyone who's been a carryover candidate. There are some that have been open since, I think, the late 90s still. I think there's one or two that might still be open from there. They have to file a report every January 10th. But as long as they're an inactive candidate, that's the only report they file.
And are those reports on the website?
We don't typically put them on our website, but we can make them available. They're a public report. When we post our reports, honestly, we have that. Those of you who have been to our site and pulled up a campaign finance report, you're familiar with our grid of reports. We're looking at revamping this a little bit so it's a little more accessible, and we archive some of the older reports so you can still get to them. We typically upload current candidates, essentially. But we're always happy to provide any campaign finance document to anyone who asks for it.
I'd like to have those.
Absolutely.
And the second thing is, when you answered the previous question, it made me have a question. So let's use an example that I work at a university, and so that's a state employee. And I'm also in the legislature. How do you know when the duties are overlapping?
Well, this particular issue was more about receiving compensation from one for the
How do you know? How do you know?
In that type of situation where you would have a university employee, typically their duties as an employee are stated somewhere. It's, for example, they're conducting research, teaching classes, publishing things, anything like that. Those are not part of the same duties that are typically legislative duties. I know all of you obviously perform quite a bit of research and analysis.
So if the duties are different,
Yes, typically.
but so let's say I'm a school teacher, and I'm not asking for opinions here, but just so I can understand. So I'm a school teacher, and Senator Dahl's a school teacher, but he isn't in the Senate and I am, and we both earn the same amount of money, and I'm here. Does it make any difference?
Essentially, what we're talking about here is, let's say for some reason, let's say you were a school teacher and you were in the legislature, and the school wanted to, as a result of some sort of activity you're doing in the legislature, wanted to compensate you for that. Like you're doing some advocacy for the school or something like that, and they wanted to provide you some payment for that. They could not do that because
They are paying me.
well,
Because they're paying the person who isn't here.
right, but they would be paying you for your outside employment, which is a separate universe. If they were paying you specifically some additional amount to advocate for them in the legislature, then that would be impermissible because part of your legislative duties is engaging these issues. And essentially conducting legislative activity. The issue here was, as long as you're not receiving that compensation for something that's part of your official state duties, then it's fine. That was really the underlying issue here.
All right, thank you, thank you.
And I'm happy to provide a copy of that opinion. I think it might provide some context that will help here.
Senator Haley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and this goes beyond the scope of your report, which I greatly appreciate as well, most informative as always. But to Senator Schallenberger's question and expansion of that, the duality of roles, being a state employee or a legislator and perhaps working in another capacity, has not been fully vetted or explored, or are there some clear definitions as to where one can be both a legislator and then work for another branch of state or any other government? The question is coming up, and I didn't know if there was any direction that's already in statute that might further illuminate those of us like myself who are confused as to how that can be the case.
No, and I appreciate the question. I will do my best to compact our entire conflict of interest training that I give for state employees into a very brief answer. Really what this comes down to is there's nothing prohibiting someone who is a state employee or a legislator from working outside of state government, or from working outside of state government or in some other role, and even in state government. The issue is that you can't participate in a contract between the two entities. So, for example, several years ago, while I was an assistant debate coach in the Olathe School District as well, if there was some way that I could have formed a contract between the Ethics Commission and the Olathe School District, then I don't know what that would look like, but I could not have done that. I couldn't have participated in that contract. It would be a conflict. If there was a pre-existing conflict, I couldn't have been part of the administration of that contract. It would be a conflict of interest. If the contract had gone out for bid and the Olathe School District had won it, that would be permissible. It's considered there's an exception that's carved out for contracts that go out for bid. But generally speaking, if you're not accepting compensation from the private sector, from something that's your official state duties, and you're not participating in those contracts, then there's not a prohibition that applies here in state government. I know there was a bill that was introduced somewhere. I filled out a fiscal note response to it that would prohibit statewide elected officials from essentially receiving private or a compensation, some sort of employment outside of state government. There's nothing that prohibits that now. That's entirely fine for them to do. There just can't be a conflict of interest in the contracting process.
Thank you, Mr. Scoggin. A brief follow-up. Let me drill down a little closer and get to where my concern is, because I don't understand it, and I think that it should be a conflict where a legislator, a member of the legislative body, might work for another branch of state government or even for another official in state government, as is the case. I understand there's no prohibition. At least to my mind, there could be a conflict, and there should. We vote on budgets, for example, and should that legislator vote for a budget for some other state official that he or she might be employed by, I'm just wondering where or why we haven't addressed that, or shouldn't we address that? Because to me, it just, or if it's ever been done prior to this year, I think it's been raised this year, and why there isn't some clear prohibition for it. And I know you don't want to opine as to why there shouldn't be a clear prohibition for it, but is it replicated somewhere else? I've checked into Missouri, by the way. Missouri, you can't do it in Missouri. Why we're able to do it here, I just don't know.
I'm unaware of a multi-state analysis of the issue. All I know is that obviously currently it's legal in Kansas, and we are neutral about any sort of change on that law. It's just not something under our jurisdiction. We don't have a problem with it as an entity because it's legal. It's entirely fine.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mark, for being here. You did, and I think very openly, say that you budget zero for your fines. I know that in many of the bills we've seen in the Ag Committee, if people collect fines, they go to the State General Fund rather than to the agency. Would you have objections, as long as we could find some other way to make sure you can pay for your staff, to having that same prohibition?
I'm always happy to talk about these issues. In general, we typically are very protective of our fee fund balances just because unexpected expenses do crop up. And we obviously can't, if we have an unexpected expense that occurs, we can't have more from the state general fund. That wouldn't, for a variety of reasons. Having the ability to take some of those balances from the fee fund is helpful in those instances. It gives us a flexibility that is necessary for an agency that has kind of the obligations and jurisdiction that we do. So I'm happy to talk about these issues. I'm not comfortable at this point saying we support or oppose. I don't have a particular position on it today.
Thank you. And if I could follow up with another question, or just actually a thank you for identifying support of federal candidates. Our Douglas County Democratic Party has a very fun ad each year that includes yard signs from all the candidates, and we've never been able to use the yard signs for our federal candidates. So there's always questions about that. Are you not supporting, someone for Congress? So thank you so much.
All right. Mark, let's talk about, I know we talk about it every year, our online submission. I personally use it. I think our conversations have made it better. Can you remind us how the Secretary of State, we're using their program that was developed many years ago, and we're uploading that program to you. Is that right? Can you remind us how that is? Secretary of State has a program that we use, and we send it to you.
Yep, statutorily, all campaign finance documents are submitted to the Secretary of State. Those of you who email it to us, we send it to them as well. And when they receive one, they send it to us. So both entities always end up with it. But yes, because statutorily they are the repository of campaign finance records, they operate the electronic filing system. They also have an IT team that can support it. I have 8.5 employees. I obviously could not do anything like that. They really do a great job. They have revamped the system a few years ago, I believe, several years ago, and they've talked about some additional changes that they're interested in making after some feedback from the legislature last year. But I know that obviously their IT team has many projects and many balls in the air at any given time. I always have appreciated working with all of the Secretary of State staff. They've always been great to work with and very responsive and helpful for us.
As is your staff, too. I have several questions for Karina, making sure I'm putting this in the right box, that I don't get one of those fun envelopes from you that make my heart stop. And it's because you're very controlled, or they're very controlled on what spaces and boxes you can use. To me, in business world, it's a chart of accounts. You don't go out of these parameters, but you have to do it right or you won't accept it. So we know you've accepted it as it is, probably no errors in how we put it together for you that the system saw. So I do see the value in that. And I do think we've moved the needle on it. We haven't got to where you want, but because of these conversations, we make it better every time. And every time we use it, we can find little quirks that we can talk to the Secretary of State's office. Was this an easy fix? So I'm glad you have that conversation with us every year. Do you have a cleanup bill proposed in the House? Do you have a bill? You mentioned you'd like to have a cleanup bill. Have you drafted that, and has it been submitted to any chamber?
I think the House has introduced a bill for cryptocurrency, for our cleanup bill, and I know one is drafted but not yet submitted for, because of a small late-breaking change, for the support of federal candidates exemption. There are also a couple of other bills involving the only reasonable interpretation test for express advocacy, fixing 252407, the local paid-for attribution and campaign and constitutional ballot advocacy. Those have all been introduced. I believe the support of federal candidates will also be introduced on the House side shortly. These were just introduced yesterday, so I don't have bill numbers.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And Senator Thompson.
Yeah, and Mark, Senate Bill 86 is a bill that's coming up next week. That also is a bill regarding ethics, particularly with the county commissioner level or any governmental official who signs a wind lease or solar lease, that they must recuse themselves. We would appreciate you weighing in on that bill as well.
Sure, and I'm happy to be present at a hearing and provide any testimony.
Okay.
I've seen the bill. I haven't read it extremely in a very nuanced fashion. I've seen the title and read a quick summary of it.
Just wanted to bring it to your attention.
I definitely appreciate that because obviously a lot happens over here, and sometimes things we see some things, we don't see others. I will say that local issues, we have jurisdiction over local campaign finance when it's a first-class city or Board of Public Utilities. The Wichita School Board specifically, or anything bigger than that, essentially. Anything smaller than that is outside of our jurisdiction. Right. And local ethics rules, we have advisory jurisdiction over. We can issue formal opinions, but we have no enforcement jurisdiction. So if there's a local ethics issue that arises, a local conflict violation, it's up to a DA or county prosecutor to enforce currently.
Sure.
And to be clear, I am not requesting any change to that system unless I have the funds to find some other staff in another office to put them in. So.
Sure, we want any ethical conflict that you see may not be within your purview, but would like the thoughts.
Absolutely, and I definitely appreciate knowing about the bill and making sure you give that comment to me. I'll make sure that I'm present for any hearing.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think that's all I have for Mark here. I don't see any other questions. Thank you, Mark, for joining us, and you're welcome to come in anytime. And local government too, we're the same folks. So if you're in here for that bill, that's same room, same place, same time. I do want to let the committee know we're on a very tight schedule. In fact, there's 5 days less than what we've had before. And if we haven't been given 17 budgets, including yours, Mark, it might be more than that. So, and they've moved up the timeline, so we will be hearing budgets for three days in a row. Do you think there's six or so each? 5 and 6 each time, so we'll have to move fast on those. So that's going to take up at least 3 slots of our time. And we do have a bill scheduled for February as well, so our days are running out. So if it is good, Mark, that these ethic bills that you mentioned are in the House to cross over to us because we have very little time. So we appreciate that too. And I do want to remind us, our next meeting is scheduled for February 1st. And then you can, is that budget's February 1st? So that's how fast we're going to start on those. And remember, we just have 55 minutes to get through those. But I think we've done this in the past very efficiently, and we can do this again. So I believe that's all I have for the committee, and we're adjourned.